Director of Chatham House's Africa Programme, and I'm delighted to welcome you on behalf of Chatham House and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung to Angola Forum 2020. We have just over 500 people registered from around the world participating today, a reminder of international interest in Angola, even in these difficult COVID-19 times. Our Angola Forum is our flagship event on Angola in our year. It succeeds the British Angola Forum that was launched in 1998, and our forum continues to be one of the few focal points of expertise on Angolan affairs and international relations outside of the Portuguese-speaking world. Our Africa program also provides administrative and research support to the all-party parliamentary group on Angola, which is based in the United Kingdom Parliament. This is not the first time we have partnered with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. In 2017, before Zoom was really even created, we held physical meetings at the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung headquarters in Berlin and at Chatham House in London, backed up by Skype calls on TV screens. Our Angola Forum 2017 theme was economic diversification, development, and strengthening democracy. And I know that some of you who are registered today watched that particular meeting. O Angola Forum 2018, em parecer como Ministério de Defesa de Angola, marcou o 30 aniversário de
has marked the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Quinavinova, and they got together to deal with this and with its legacy in
conservation and economic development in Angola, hosting an international event at Chatham House in partnership with the Halo Trust that included a keynote address by the Duke of Sussex, Prince Harry, and Angola's then Minister for the Environment, Paulo Coelho. As many of you will remember, a few months later, Prince Harry visited Angola to Dirico in the far south in Cubango province. He then went to Wambo and walked on the street that his mother had walked during the war in Angola, and Luanda. Although the Angola Forum is our flagship event, our publications and meetings throughout the year provide informed analysis about modern Angola. We have written our own assessments on Angola's economic reforms and politics. In October 2018, we hosted a cross-party delegation from Angola's National Assembly to discuss the nature and scope of recent reforms in Angola and the role of the legislator in affecting political change. As some of you will remember, the delegation was led by Deputy Maria Dalina de Oliveira Valente, who was the leader of the delegation from the MPLA, but it also included several of their colleagues from UNITA, including Deputy Miraldina Jamba, for example. En cuanto este año, en Janeiro de 2020.
Well, in this year, in January 2020, a delegation of the Ministry of the government led by Manuel José Nunes Jr., Minister of the State of Economic and Social Development, spoke to a packed audience at Chatham House on Angola's business promise. This led to a number in the audience expressing to me afterwards about their optimism over Angola under President Lourenço.
We did not, however, anticipate the global spread of COVID-19 and its economic impact, causing death and hardship globally. Angola has not escaped, badly impacted by the collapsing commodity prices and needing to service a public debt burden above GDP. Angolan independence in 1975 was born out of struggle. His Excellency, the Ambassador Geraldo Nundo, Angola's ambassador to the Court of St. James here in the United Kingdom, during his virtual Angola National Day reception earlier this month, reminded me and other guests of this history, but also reminded us of Angolan resilience. Today's Angola Forum 2020 focuses on the economics and about how to get a more inclusive economy. What is the state of the Angolan economy? How can reform and growth be achieved? We will also hear later from civil society and the political opposition on where they see the need for improvements. How can Angola be built back better post-COVID. Tomorrow we have a session on Angola's green economy. We've reinvigorated efforts to combat climate change internationally. How is Angola preparing for a low carbon future? All of these are tough issues and don't have perfect answers, but I hope all of us will be better informed about modern Angola from participating in Angola Forum 2020. This is a meeting that will be fully on the record, and I'm very delighted with a strong showing of speakers today and tomorrow. We will have an opportunity also for asking questions, so please feel free to use your raise hand function, and we may well come to you, but also to ask your questions through the Q&A function if you prefer that way. So finally, I'm going to now introduce the first chair who will chair the session on the economy of reform and investment in Angola, and that is Carlos Lopez. Carlos is no stranger to Angola. He is a member of the President's Economic and Social Council. He is also an associate fellow of the Africa program at Chatham House. And he has occupied several leadership positions across the UN system, including policy director for the Secretary General Kofi Annan and executive secretary of the United Economic Commission for Africa. He is a member of the African Union reform team and doubles as the organization's high representative for partnerships with Europe. He is also a member of the Global Commission for Economy and Climate, the African Academy of Sciences, and the Lisbon Academy of Sciences, and the boards of the Africa Leadership Institute and Geneva Graduate Institute. Carlos is from Guinea-Bissau. Carlos, I'm very grateful for you to agree to provide the chairing of our first session and to also act as a discussant. I will hand over to you now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this very kind introduction. I see on the screen that Alves da Rocha has just joined. So I wonder whether you would like to start by introducing Alves da Rocha, and then I take from you and him to continue with the panel.
Okay, I hadn't noticed Alves had joined us, but I'm delighted. So Alves da Rocha is giving our keynote address this morning. He is no stranger to Chatham House or the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. He spoke at one of our meetings on fostering the future, promotion and development of Angola's financial system in 2011 in Luanda. And the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is funding the English translation of his Angola economic report. Alves is at the Catholic University at the SEAC. He is an economist, a senior researcher at SEAC currently, and also serves as the director and coordinator of the Department of Economic Studies. He is also an associate professor at the Catholic University of Angola, where he teaches the chairs of public finance and economic integration. Alves should be no surprise to anybody because he is a frequent writer of opinion articles in some national and international media and the author of several books. His latest version of Angola's economic study has been completed in Portuguese, and I believe will later next month be published in English with the help of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Alves, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I'm delighted that once again to be hosting you at Chatham House, and I hand over to you to give your remarks. Thank you very much. Alves, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'm saying that I'm delighted to participate in this forum, and this is a pleasure to see you again after several years, because you have already collaborated in terms of SEIC and in terms of social and economic studies for Angola. It is a pleasure, and also to participate in this meeting with Carlos Lopez. I know quite well Carlos Lopez, and it is also a pleasure to be with you, Carlos.
So, Alves, thank you very much. And I wonder if you'd like to make your remarks about the Angolan economy. We'd be delighted to hear your presentation. Feel free to present either in Portuguese or in English. We have simultaneous translation.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know how many time I have to say something about the Angolan economy and also the Angolan society, but I will use maybe for the beginning 10 minutes to say something about the Angolan economy. Do you agree?
That's perfect. Thank you very much.
And allow me to do this presentation in Portuguese because it is much more for me to speak in Portuguese than in English. Ora bem, Angola.
Well, Angola, in terms of economy and its society, is facing a rather critical situation. This is a scenario that has been long lasting for a while already. I know that based on the economic reports, it has been made known the severity of the economic situation in Angola since 2009, namely since the international economic crisis that happened in the wake of the subprime crisis, and then it has rippled around the globe. This crisis has led to a decrease in the oil costs, of the prices of the barrels, and since then, Angola has suffered in its growth. If we are to analyze the official statistics, we will be able to identify that 2008 was the very last year in which the GDP has grown in two digits. From 2009 onwards, this ability and this growth has vanished, namely because of a number of external factors, but also due to our own guilt of not having introduced in due time such reforms that would allow us to resist the negative effects of this very crisis. As I read reports written by international economists, a number of economies are yet to recover from the nefarious effects of the 2008-2009 crisis. As we well know, Angola starkly depends upon oil, not only in its revenues, but also on its tax income. And when the price of the oil in the world is shaken, or when there is an unease of the demand for oil, Angola immediately suffers that. So it's immediate. There's no buffer time from the change of demand and the effects we suffer in Angola. So Angola continues suffering from such inability to build alternative sources for its economic growth. Oil is the sector that mostly contributes in the growth in the country. Of course, when the prices and exports in Angola suffer a downturn, the effect of our GDP growth is immediate. And from then on, Angola has lost its ability for growth. In 2014, a new oil price crisis strikes the world, and from 2015 onwards, the country has endured an economic crisis. And in my opinion, Angola is being faced with a social recession in which social indicators are in degradation. In such respect, the government has conceived a number of intervening projects in the economy attempting to revert this cycle of crisis and social issues. From 2019 onwards, remembering that the pandemic was made official in the world starting in December 2019, and basing ourselves on this, I would say that Angola is being a victim of two crises. These crises have hindered this growth dynamics that was initially identified in 2018. Such growth dynamics will take a long time, or at least some time, to be overcome, namely because of the COVID-19 effects. And we don't know how long the economies worldwide will take to find the old growth levels experienced in the past. In Europe, there's a debate as to whether countries will find indeed a vaccine, and there's a lot of expectation in this regard. Will the economies be able to recover their economy? Will they recover in V or in WV or in W or in any other expression? Of course, those economies which do not offer elevated resilience are those who will linger longer in the crisis. Most of the clients in Angola, especially in the United States and Europe, are countries that are currently dealing with negative GDP growth levels, and the forecasts for 2021 are not exactly encouraging. And with this facet of foreign trade, it will be very hard for Angola to recover its natural growth dynamics. And then added to this, we have external factors. For instance, I know that the World Trade Organization is taking a stand against this, and especially the European Commission, United States, and Russia have all taken a stand against the decisions Angola have been taking on the diversification of the economy. These are measures that have been hindering the imports of various commodities and products. And this is with the conviction that the replacement of such commodities will be naturally occurring. This will hinder the entrance of products and commodities, and with that, there will be internal opportunities for such imports be replaced for our nationally produced commodities or products. I'm not sure as to whether what rate this is happening. I know that there's a position from the government in this regard, but I don't know with what rate this will take place, namely the replacement of imports. I have been reading a number of news articles and some signs that might point towards a replacing of the nationally produced products, but in real terms, what we have realized by the indicators that the inflation rates could reach 26 to 27% till the end of the year. In October, we were in 25%. And also from official reports, the GDP for the second term this year has reduced 8.8%. But as far as we know, this is the right number because there were issues with the calculation of these numbers, which led the researchers and research centers, both in Angola and outside, and entrepreneurs were questioning what would be the growth dynamics for the second term of 2020. Well, what we do know is that in the first quarter, there was a reducing of the GDP in Angola around 2.2%. And we have also experienced reducing of 8.8% of the GDP reduction in the second quarter. And for the third quarter, we will be in the very same levels. We understand that the entrepreneurial fabric in Angola is undergoing stark challenges in terms of taxing, labor, private investment. I am looking forward to the speech from the representative of the Institute analyzing foreign investment in Angola. But what we do see based on these data is that those programs developed by the government, they aim at inverting that downfall of the GDP, and those are not working. I understand that in these issues, it's like inverting the variables of the equation because we are not taking into account the behavior of economic variables. And I understand that there are measures that the time lag is longer than other measures, comparably speaking. Other measures can take place in a month or in a quarter. But the fact is that this recovery is not taking place. The Ministry of Finance, in its report aiming at 2021, affirms that the Angolan economy will suffer a decrease of 3.2 or 3.3%. Our estimates refer to the SAIC, which is a macroeconomic model. And this is where we deal with all macroeconomic modules of the company, of this agency. And the estimates we ran in April this year, when we developed the very first study in Angola developed by the consequences of COVID in the Angolan economy. And in these studies, we took into account two critical measures, the measures that the government understood that they should take into account in order to decrease job losses and to support companies in a sense that it should fall into the effects of the confinement, because these effects of the COVID over people, we're trying to mitigate those effects in the economy. And this very study is on the website.
Visão para a taxa de crescimento do PIB em Angola para
The GDP for 2020 was minus 6.8%. We had the opportunity before in Luanda and also in relation to other institutions that analyze these things to see that our estimates for this year done by banking institutions, our estimates tend to be too optimistic because you cannot see through the banking side certain movements in terms of credit and so on, because these are symptoms that the economy is moving. And of course, all the situation of the decline of the economy, negative growth rates, for example, I believe that 2015 is the beginning of this regression. In 2015, the global was 0.9%, and recession from then on has been systematic and continuous. And the effect of the pandemic from this year has certainly shown this. And I would say that unfortunately for us Angolans, we have the perfect tempest, an economic crisis that is now associated to the pandemic crisis. And I believe that our prospects for the future, and when I'm talking about the future, I'm talking up to 2025 and 2020, it means that the recovery will take time and GDP growth will be positive but slow, but low. And if we project this economic situation to the social area, we can see that we are also declining socially. And a clear indicator of this is the reduction of our GDP per inhabitant, which has come down since around 2014 or even before. And in 2020, according to our estimates, and estimates based on official statistics, we don't have the financial capacity to conduct surveys, and all our studies are based on official statistics and official documents. So in 2020, the GDP per person in dollars will be less than $1,700. And with this $1,700 mean a decrease of $5,000 to $1,700. And this obviously has some consequences on the poverty of the population and its capacity to produce income. And this lack of growth in the economy can only be recovered through private investment. And this is also having consequences on the employment rate. The unemployment rate, according to our information, in the world is around 33–34%, with a specific incidence on 15th to 24-year-olds, where the unemployment rate must reach around 44–45%. This is really a waste for the economy. We know that from the classic point of view, the two main production factors is capital and work. And when there is no work, this means a lack of capacity of using our workforce to bring growth to the economy. As I've already mentioned, the government is aware, and of course it needs to be, because it needs to govern. It needs to be aware of what is going on and to find the best models and the best policies to address this. So it is because of this that the government made an agreement with the IMF so that it would not only lend money to Angola, and I believe that the overall budget with adjustments would be around $4.5 million, but also to help the country to find a better model to recover its macroeconomic balance. But these interventions and these suggestions from the IMF are not taking any effect. Poverty rate is continuing to increase. Inequality in sharing growth is still there, despite the fact that the World Bank has lent $2 billion and part around $500,000 was to promote an increase in the income of some families. But without growth, these policies fail. Fiscal consolidation cannot happen without growth. Fighting poverty without economic growth is not possible. And then, therefore, the way I interpret this, that this scenario in Angola involves all this. In the social area, the government has made a number of efforts investing in 2019 and 20 in more in health and education. Of course, in the investment in health is comes out of the need to invest because of the crisis, but I am apprehensive in relation to the economic and social situation of my country and its repercussions from the political point of view, and when will it be possible for us to change this negative dynamics in terms of the growth of the GDP. We have had a number of opportunities of doing so, but we've missed this opportunity. And to conclude, I would like to say that this crisis, with reflections in the social areas starts from 2015. So we have been for the last 5 years in systematic and accumulated recessions with disastrous effects on the living conditions of the population. I think everybody's concerned about this. We now need, especially the government with the IMF and the World Bank, we have to see whether the policies implemented are having positive effects. For example, the policy for the devaluation of the exchange rate. I have seen a number of positions. Some people believe that it's important to find a balance through the mechanisms of the markets, and that is the devaluation of the exchange rates. And there are other positions where people believe that the effects of this devaluation is producing negative effects to society and the economies. And therefore, we need to find new ways of finding a convergence there. But I have to say that without economic growth, it's not possible to do anything else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alves de Rocha, for giving us a really exhaustive and comprehensive assessment of the Angolan economy this year, and your concerns about the impact of an economy that remains in deep recession and the social and political impact of that. I must say I'm very delighted that His Excellency, the President, in September appointed you to his Economic and Social Council, as he has also with Professor Lopes, because this is not a simple task. As you already highlighted in your presentation, the decay of the Angolan economy went back to 2015. So this is deeply structural. It's also clearly about over-addiction to one commodity, petroleum. And tomorrow we'll be talking about the green economy, and how global demands are going to change. So these are interconnected. What I suggest, Alves, is I'm going to hand over to Professor Carlos Lopes now, so that he has the presentation from Faucio Musa, and then open up to a discussion between yourselves and Professor Lopes and to our audience. So with no more ado, Carlos, thank you again for agreeing to participate today. Let me hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex, and good afternoon again to all of you. I'm going to introduce Faucio Musa, who has been working with Standard Bank for quite some time, actually most of his career after a stint at the Central Bank of Mozambique. He's Mozambican himself, and his exposure to Standard Bank is very timely for this discussion, given the role that the bank itself plays in Africa. Is by far the largest bank in the continent, and also because of the interest that that particular bank has on the investment promotion, which is one of the issues that we were going to cover in this particular session. So I'm going to basically give him the floor. After giving him the floor for about 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to provoke some questions to the audience and to our speakers based on their own presentations, but also other considerations that might not have been covered by their presentations. So we have a pretty good grasp of the challenges that Angola is facing, particularly the economic dimensions of COVID, that, as we know, are impacting all countries, and of course Angola is no exception, but are particularly acute in Angola for reasons that we can explore later. So without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Faucio Musa. You are most welcome to give your presentation. You can give it in Portuguese or English, but I understand you want to do it in English, which is fine. I just want to remind everybody that we have simultaneous translation, so it will be easy for any of you to follow in either language. So Faucio, you have the floor, and welcome.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Professor Carlos Lopes. I have prepared some slides, but I'm not sure if I will be able to share the screen. Let me just check. Yes, it looks like I will be able to share the screen. The slides are just to give you a picture on the message that I will be portraying this afternoon. Please let me know if you can see full screen mode on my slides.
It's working, it's fine.
All right, thanks very much. Before I proceed, I just would like you to bear with me that as a member of Standard Bank research team, we need to show you the disclaimer. Of course, there's forward-looking views that I'm going to be commenting on. From a compliance point of view, you need to understand that we could change views without even letting you know, especially because we live in a dynamic world. We do not anticipate to know the future. We present our forecasts based on the best of our knowledge, and we hope that you can take it as it. So in terms of Angola, I think the first item is about COVID. The numbers really do not make justice to the suffering that is going on in Angola. When we compare Angola with the other geographies, it's displaying much low levels of infections, but again, the suffering is substantial, especially if we take into account the background that Professor Alves Rocha has already made in the beginning of this meeting. There is a very high level of unemployment. From a government point of view, there are fiscal pressures that also impacts the level of response that Angola could face. I think the main question now is, as we look into Europe and other geographies, they seem to have emerged in a second wave of COVID infections. Our question for Angola is, has we already witnessed that peak of daily infections, or that is still to come in future? I believe as we debate these issues, we can hear also opinions from other participants. I wanted also to comment on the outlook for next year, not only for Angola, but from a global economy perspective. Standard Bank firmly believes that next year, it should be a year of a recovery. Of course, there are elements that could bring a more, let's say, risk-on element for the global economy. Certainly, the outcome of the US elections, how tight is OPEC going to manage the oil cut production, which has impact in oil prices, how strong is the recovery from China. We can start, I believe, or we can start to see some elements of strong trading coming from China. So I believe that all that will inform us how strong is going to be the recovery next year. Unfortunately for Angola, we still see the economy in recession next year. We have published last week an update on our forecasts for Angola. And we start by improving our forecasts for the exchange rate. But before we get into the numbers, I want to make justice to some quality issues that we find in Angola. Back in 2017, when President João Lourenço took over, Angola could not trade in dollars, could not make settlement in dollars. Most of the transactions were in euros, with certain European correspondent banks also being able to support Angola with that kind of trade. And one of the first initiatives from his cabinet was really to bring external support. And of course, this is aligned with the fight on corruption. We have seen the US Treasury Department visiting Angola and supporting the country technically, so that from a compliance point of view, they could experience substantial improvement to the extent that commercial banks would be able to offer settlement of transactions in US dollar. So I look back and I look at Angola today, there is a major improvement in that front. Of course, this is aligned with the fighting corruption, and we can see from the IMF program, they clearly highlight some progress in that area. That I believe that it's going to have strong positive effect in years to come. One element of Angola is that there are dramatic changes going on in different areas of the economy, but the results may take time to materialize, to become visible. And perhaps as we look at our foreign exchange forecasts, when we published in September, we expected to close this year at 689 kwanza per dollar. When we published the forecasts last week, the kwanza was trading at 661. Today is at 649. Perhaps these are early signals that there is an adjustment going on in the foreign exchange. We believe that the kwanza could be undervalued at the moment. We have published on this last month. Coincidentally, this is the same opinion of the IMF. Basically, we can see a substantial decline on import demand in Angola, which is a reflection of low growth for a long time, where imports of goods decline from about $1.3 billion per month to around $800 million per month. So a substantial decline on imports. I do not believe that this decline is only a function of a higher exchange rates, which impacts demand. I believe that imports decline in Angola is also a function of improvements on compliance issues. I believe that some illegal imports are now being avoided, especially with central bank improving the opening up of balance of payments. Commercial banks are now the ones that need to validate all the import documentation they receive from their clients. And we believe that clients that are really willing to repatriate dividends or to make capital payments, they are now using the proper channels. This could help us understand why there was a substantial decline on imports. So in terms of going into 2021, we see the kwanza rising by around 11% against the dollar, which is much lower than what we have experienced since 2018, when the currency rose by around 86%, then it rose by 50% in the following year. This year, we see the kwanza closing the year with an increase of around 24%. So this currency adjustment is extremely painful. And I support the view that it's not only through this kind of adjustment that we can see the Angolan economy is stabilizing. There is a strong privatizations program going on in Angola, which I believe it has potential to support the fiscus with some revenue. But more than that, I believe that Angola is really changing into an economy where the government wants to become solely the regulator and allow the economy to be driven by private sector, which means that investment is likely to be the driver of growth for Angola. Unfortunately, as you look at our bottom row in this slide, we see Angola still in recession next year. And even after temporary exiting recession in 2022, it looks like the economy will not be able to sustain growth in 2023. And the main reason for that is maturing oil fields, which could have an impact in oil production. Even if we see some foreign direct investment flowing through the oil sector next year, we are not sure about the quantum and if it will be able to sustain oil output at around 1.2 million barrels per day or 1.3 million barrels per day. So I would love to see some more confirmations of foreign direct investment into Angola so that I can update my 2023 forecasts from a negative into positive. So that is the main element there. Of course, from an inflation point of view, it's quite painful for the citizen experiencing double-digit inflation for many years already. And even in the next 2 or 3 years, we still see inflation in Angola remaining at double digits. BNA most likely will keep policy rates on hold because effectively the transmission mechanism of the monetary policy remains quite fragile, and I believe BNA expects to achieve their monetary policy goals by managing the Kwanzaa liquidity. And that kind of liquidity management also helps us to build this view that perhaps we are getting into a more stable period from a currency point of view. Last week alone, Minister of Finance made available to the markets $600 million. That, combined with the forward auction BNA launched in the beginning of the month, it totals $750 million that was made available to the market this month. And we saw demand only for 50% of that amount. It means that for some reason, as we speak, the market is experiencing, we can say, excess dollar liquidity. The reason why Minister of Finance was able to sell dollars to the market, I believe, is my personal opinion, is that perhaps they are more confident about the restructuring of debt negotiations with China. That most likely will help save some money that can be deployed to support the Angolan economy. This exhibit shows the fiscal budget for Angola, and it's painful the level of cut in expenditure as a percentage of GDP that we can witness here. 2012, and oil revenues were at around 34% of GDP, contributing to the fiscal budget. This year and next year, that is likely to remain below 10%, which is a material decline. On the back of that substantial decline on oil revenues, we have seen Angolan authorities.
Além de uma queda de receitas, já fizemos um corte de gastos e o principal resultado é de que
deficit than it would be if they were not cutting expenditure to match decline on revenues. So when we look at the government budget, last year they expected, so for this year, the initial budget was targeting a surplus of 1.3% of GDP, fiscal surplus. That would be a continuation of surplus that Angola is recording since 2018. Of course, the pandemic forced them to change the budget, and now it's anticipated a deficit of 4% of GDP. Next year, likely to remain in deficit, much lower at 2.2% of GDP. I think what's important to read from the budget is that there is strong commitment from the Angolan authorities to really manage the growth in external debt, which at the moment is expected at 123% of GDP. Before I end this presentation, I just wanted to make one comment on resource allocation. Again, when we look at the percentages of GDP, overall expenditure in 2012 was around 35% of GDP. Next year, the target is 21.1% of GDP. Critical to note is that interest, let's say domestic borrowings interest rose from 0.6% of GDP to 2.5% of GDP. This means that Angola had to incur into an increased domestic debt to fund its fiscal deficit. External borrowings also grew substantially, with interest on external borrowings rising from 0.3% of GDP in 2012 to 3.7% of GDP expected next year. When we look at financing expenditure, it has, I mean, there is an attempt from the Angolan authorities to really bring it down from around 19% of GDP this year to 14% of GDP next year, which is roughly similar to what it was in 2012. But again, this means domestic debt repayment of 7% of GDP and external debt repayment of 5.3% of GDP. So there is an ongoing structural adjustment that combines front-loaded fiscal adjustment, tight monetary policy, even if that is not fully reflected on interest rates, which remain negative in real terms. But of course, it has to do with dynamics of the transmission mechanism. There is an effort of authorities to smooth the fiscal subsidy reform, where World Bank is supporting the government with transfers to families, so that as the Angolan authorities start to remove the fuel subsidies, the impact on the poor families is reduced. So just to wrap up my message, it's still going to take some time before we see structural reforms producing improvements in the pockets of citizens. But we remain quite encouraged by what the government was able to do so far, given all the restrictions that they face with, and given the, I would say, extreme challenges to really change the economy, to really reduce corruption, to open up the economy for foreign investors. They've already done a change in investment law. It's much easier to get a visa to Angola. Of course, the pandemic just creates travel quite difficult, but we have noticed substantial improvements. The Angolan economy also has, I believe, a few sectors that could become recipients of foreign direct investment. One is agriculture, with a lot of potential being there in country. The other one is tourism. I believe Angola could start opening up for tourism. Mining is also another sector with strong potential. So the ingredients for success remain there, but I believe it's still going to be quite painful, and there is still a lot of uncertainty because of high dependency on oil and also high dependency on external investment to bring about changes in economy. I would stop here and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Faucio. You can now take the slides off screen. Yeah, thank you. Really, I want to appreciate your contribution. You have been quite complimentary to some of the efforts that are being done by the government. And you have presented us with a very detailed macroeconomic picture that actually gives us a very interesting perspective in relation to what Alves da Rocha was presenting to us from a structural point of view. I think it's important for people to realize that since the turn of the century, Angola has experienced almost everything. It has been amongst the fastest growing countries in the world. It has been also amongst the countries with a deeper impact from oil prices and recession. It has been one of the most exposed African countries in terms of debt to GDP ratio. And it has also been before a country that was expanding quite significantly in terms of its social programs. So we have seen everything. And what really comes out of that picture is a certain instability, given that most of these developments are related to when the oil prices are up or down, and whether, you know, there are issues of governance in the country. But we don't see, and Angola, I think, is an absolute example and demonstration of that, we don't see a structural transformation of the economy. So it's an economy that has grown when it has grown without structural transformation. And therefore, it has not diversified enough and continues to be based on rent that comes mostly from oil. With a fiscal pressure that is extremely low, it turns around 10%. It's amongst the countries in Africa with the lowest capacity of the state to actually mobilize internal economic activity in terms of taxes. Huge levels of inequality explain part of it, but it's also a very difficult maneuvering of state and public institutions to deal with corruptive practices that therefore have contributed to not having enough capacity in terms of fiscal pressure. So we have a picture basically of a country that needs reform. And I think everybody realizes reform is an urgent matter in Angola. You can do reforms in different ways, in different shapes. And I think when you are dealing with an economy that is basically commodity dependent, reforms are much more harder during an environment where the main commodities that the country exports are not in a very good stance. That's exactly what is happening in Angola. So we have to do and envisage reforms at a time where it's the most difficult. And this is before COVID. Now, if you add the COVID to the equation, obviously the situation becomes even more daring. And I think that's what basically Alves da Rocha and Faucio were detailing for us to understand in terms of the practical implications. So the bottom line question is, can Angola turn around based on the premises of the past? We know not. So on what basis? What are the ingredients that are going to make, first, the reform viable, and second, the prospects of the country to do structural transformation, diversify its economy, possible? Now, we know that for the last 17 quarters, the revenues from oil have been going down consecutively. So are we looking into the future with sort of more optimism about oil revenues? I don't think so. Everybody agrees that the best you can hope in the oil markets is to extend a bit your luck a few years, because the turning of the tide is already occurring. So now renewable energies are more competitive from an investment opportunity point of view, and the prices of oil are experiencing such levels of volatility that they depend much more on factors that were not the orthodox ingredients for risk assessment. So we are really in a conundrum here, where the economy of the country is in a dire need for reform and transformation, but it's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult. So I want to ask first Alves da Rocha a question about the IMF, because there is the IMF design proposal for the reforms. And we have heard from Faucio that he felt it was going in the right direction. It may take a bit longer to get results to the ground in terms of touching people's lives, but he basically professed some faith that these reforms were going in the right direction. And he gave us two examples that are quite significant in terms of this possible positive impact. One is the availability of hard currency for external transactions, that Angola was no longer in a position to fulfill 2 or 3 years back. And then a second example he gave us was, this determination in some of the reforms, such as the one for fuel subsidies. So I'm going to park some questions for Faucio later, but I wanted to ask Alves da Rocha first. What do you think of the IMF design proposals? Are they really of a nature to turn this situation around? And if you believe so, why? Please unmute yourself. Microphone. Alves da Rocha, microfone.
Ok.
Pronto.
Estás-me a ouvir agora?
Sim, sim.
Can you hear me? Beautiful. I'll keep on speaking in Portuguese because my English is not on par with yours as is with Faucio's case. But I'd like to say the following. Well, the IMF and its presence in Angola is object of a number of critiques, especially in regards to the IMF's proposed measures and what they are and the way they are being implemented. And what is exactly what Faucio mentioned is the case of the subsidies. And I have to say that the government has stepped back. It has receded on the decision to make the fuel prices closer to the ones we can call the marketplace or the market prices. But such policies that the government has been implemented, proposed by the IMF, and the IMF proposes that, and the government is able to accept or not.
Foi chamada Angola.
But what we see is that the IMF has been called into Angola in the latter part of 2018, and we see that there's a challenge in its implementation. And despite my agreeing with Faucio that it takes time so that such measures bring about its outcomes. But my question, which is shared by a number of people in Angola, is based on the outcomes such measures will bring about. Well, what we see taking place with the devaluation of the Panza is an increase of interest rates and also a challenge, a hardship of importing specific products in order to supplement a possible internal domestic production that will come about, not in the measure needed to meet the demand, and the effects of such macroeconomic adjustments we know that a country cannot live with a state that has a budget below par. There will be immediate and future consequences on that. What we need to know is the dynamics and in what measure these will be implemented. But we need to bear in mind that in Portugal, when Troika entered Portugal to give the country assistance in as to how to absorb the public debt, we had 200% of interest. the country is not bankrupt because I believe they're working in a hard currency, euro. But what happened is that the measures implemented to control the deficit and the public debt was there. And all this international comparisons lead us to the fact that we need to learn from the past in order to better act in the future. We cannot forget about the past experiences. And what happens is that the social situation in Portugal has starkly decreased because facing the impossibility of using classic tools to foster exports. And I've heard about speeches from the IMF on Angola, and some of our colleagues, economists in Angola, have also agreed that devaluation will bring about an effect on the increase of exports and the diversification of exports. Of course, this is a long-term effect and not a mid-term effect, as Carlos Lopes well mentioned. We, since independence till 2002, we had total confusion between socialist, market-based, with influence from Soviet Union. And the fact is that there was an option for a market economy choice. And for that, one needs the foundations. So we had a number of opportunities to invest in the diversification of economy. But we squandered all of them. One, due to politics. Another reason was institutional in nature. But what I want to say is that, and as Carlos Lopes has well said, we need to do what we're able to do. So I went to seek for the Portuguese example because starting from 2015, the model applied in the Portuguese market was not exactly a model focused on the offer or on the fostering of the increase of production. Because if you increase production, you need to find a market. To whom will we send that? A rather more structured country is not an issue for them, but it is for Angola. So we can foster the increase of production, be it by replacement of commodities or products, or be it fostering the internal or domestic production. But in order to make good use of such opportunities, we need to focus our attention in our domestic market so that we might experience growth. And this is what we are researching on. Portugal has abandoned this model with the elections that brought about a new ideology for development. And what happened was that Portugal has changed completely the leverages of economy growth. And they based these leverages in internal demand. Now, external demand these demands were also based on exports, of course, and then there were analyses and critiques about the needs Portugal has to increase its economic production to maintain competitiveness in the international market, but that changed the model. As we move our scope to Angola, that change of model, and many people, I agree with that, do not agree with this model. Well, we had an alternative that was from the short to mid-term because we don't have conditions to base the leverages on domestic demand. the GDP per capita is decreasing. Unemployment immense. Well, nature, same challenges. Question: how can we look at the economy and then present or oppose a different model? We need to safeguard the conditions of the population because the population in Angola is undergoing immense challenges. When I am in Luanda, let me tell you, I am part of a group giving support to the outskirts of Luanda. We bring food stuff, we bring secondhand clothes, shoes, and I have to say that in these outskirts, people are in misery. There's hunger. There is an immense number of children malnourished. So, how can we conjugate these elements of avoiding a social degrading? Well, the Catholic Church has been championing these populations living in misery. They are there. So, how can we get or bring this to happen? Structural reform and aligning this with the immediate needs for the minimum quality of life standards. We can say, well, please, composure, because the macroeconomic reforms will happen, and in 3 to 4 years, your children will experience the positive outcomes. Of course, such populations have no luxury. They cannot afford 4 years of waiting. Well, the growth estimates presented by Faucio, our friend, they reflect, in my opinion, perspective of the bank. I'm not sure what was the model. I know that the model I presented was the macroeconomic one and SLM IBP. We work with these variables, and interestingly, well, we talk about models and forecasts. Forecasts are just forecasts. They depend upon the variables to be considered, the models, but they are very close to the reality because we believe that a recovery of growth will not take place before 2028. And we end up being in agreement here. And now, just to conclude, Carlos, well, how can Impelasa present the conclusions for the coming elections? How? With what sort of concreteness? Well, unemployment rates up to 2022 will not decrease. No chance. There are no investments. There are no internal or domestic macroeconomic environment to bring appeal to investors. Bureaucracy and red tape are still a very solid hindrance, and there were a number of critiques from these countries. There was a lot of protectionism in this issue of replacing products and commodities. So how can we touch on unemployment rates and interest and inflation rates? Because if it's true that one of the control components of interest rates is currency policies, and then another form of control is increase of offering of domestic production. In this case, countries are now able to supplement domestic production with imports. Now, if our forecasts are really true, and here I'm making reference to the decrease of the GDP, and since 2014, this GDP growth is below the population growth rate, and our estimates for 2022 point to Angola jeopardizing the offering of 17 million people in poverty. I'm not talking about the multidimensional poverty, I'm talking about financial poverty. How? Well, we can present this as an intention to renew one's mandate. But such political intention can be placed or posed in a sense that up to what point these politics, be it fiscal, monetary, will contribute to mitigate these horrendous conditions the population is subject to live in. Thank you so much, Alves da Rocha. You have explained and articulated quite clearly, and the limits of the models are an imperative, according to what the IMF says, as a lack of possibilities, to use that as based on the limitation of demand. And now, posing to Fausto, and also take into account all the questions that we have been reading the chat box. And if you do have questions, please send them via the chat box. Here I have some of our guests. I have to say that people are interested in how to diversify economy, what are the alternatives, and also Fausto, the ones you mentioned about the agriculturally based, why they did not take place, and what would be the conditions that would be optimum to allow the agriculture as one of the channels for the diversification of economy. Fausto, please. Thank you so much, Carlos, for this very good question about the agriculture in Angola. I believe that the causes of this insuccess, or the lack of success, can be seen in isolation, one from another. First, there's a condition of infrastructure, and these infrastructure conditions are needed for some level of success. Angola is a fertile country. No, that's no problem. I lack some terminology.
Very good land, arable land. They have one of the richest water supplies and reserves in Africa. So they have, from a natural point of view, they have very strong ingredients for agriculture to be a success factor for the Angolan economy. But what you need to succeed in agriculture is to have, I would not dispute land property rights, but the land management, it needs to be done in such a way that provides information, who owns which land. When I say own, is not in terms of property, but to who this land has been allocated. And whenever someone gets land allocated, how stable is that lease rights, if you can put it this way. So I think there is a reform going on in that area, so that land is properly mapped and people know where to invest and what type of support they can have. Moving on, you also need infrastructure. I am aware that in certain areas of Angola, there is agricultural production that are not reaching the market because infrastructure is not there to store, but also to transport it to the markets. So I would expect agriculture to improve with infrastructure improvements. But now the question is, who is going to invest in infrastructure for Angola? I see, like in other places in Africa, private sector willing to invest to a certain extent, but bulk of it will need to come from the government. And we understand from a fiscal point of view that The only way the government could help improve infrastructure is by additional borrowings. And it's clear from the budget that the government is quite limited. If they want to achieve a sustainable budget, it's quite limited in terms of borrowing ability. So I think before we get into proper infrastructure, there is going to be a continuation of reforms that supports private initiative. And then at a certain point in time, we may see government supporting with infrastructure. I've participated in certain panels where investors from different parts of the world, but mostly from Portugal, they got support from institutions like the African Development Bank and other private institutions for investments in agriculture. Unfortunately, this year, the pandemic has put on hold a lot of initiatives. I do not want even to mention what Standard Bank is being offering on that front. But again, it's not only a function of funding being made available. One needs to look at the overall picture that supports one sector. It's not only infrastructure, but it's also skills. The skill sets that is required to develop agriculture is quite critical. And unfortunately, Angola does not have those skills. They'll need to borrow from other parts of the world. So it's a variety of items that I believe can only be resolved with time, and it requires also patience. Thank you.
Thank you. Fácio, I have a few questions from our participants. Alves da Rocha, eu dou-lhe já a palavra.
Ok. Só queria acrescentar alguma coisa ao que o Fácio...
Está certo. Fácio.
I just wanted to add a few things.
Questions that are directly related to what you just said. One, and if you can just quickly answer them. One is, what is then the role of the banking sector, of which you are somehow, familiar with, in promoting agricultural activities, particularly for small scale, not just large scale? And also, how do you explain, this is not a question that is personalized to you, but you may have the right experience and exposure. How do you explain that some NGOs and some basically small economic actors have so many difficulties accessing banking services? For instance, NGOs that may have problems with their bank accounts closed because of compliance issues and the like. So if you can just quickly answer these two follow-up questions to your very interesting presentation, then I will give Alves da Rocha also an opportunity to react to your presentation. Fácio, please.
Thank you very much. If we look at Angola banking sector, and I want to comment from a global market point of view, the entire Angolan economy, not specific to Standard Bank. The banking sector is facing at the moment a very high level of non-performing loans. This means it's more than 30% loans that are not being repaid. Of course, this is one or two particular banks that are impacting the average of the system. If we exclude those banks, the situation is much better. But I must say that even if banks are willing to support agriculture projects, and I believe there are proper incentives even through a government scheme where a much lower interest rate, which is a 7% interest rate, commercial banks in Angola can offer to specific projects that are targeted by the government. So I see that there are projects already ongoing. Unfortunately, what I don't see is the scale. I can count one project here, two projects there, three there. What Angola needs is a multitude of projects. One. Two is a lot of times people really do not grasp the difference of a banking loan and the requirement for equity. And I believe that in a lot of instances, what is needed is equity, but the client does not have where to go, so he will seek for a banking loan. Some success stories in other geographies involves commercial banks lending to large corporates, and then these large corporates then on lend to small holders in an outgrowing scheme for certain crops. I've seen success stories in many countries in the region, and perhaps that is where the Angola banking sector may focus on. But I find it also difficult for commercial banks to engage with SMEs, given the fragilities that the Angolan economy is presenting at the moment. Jumping into the NGOs question, well, I have no details on what are the issues, but I must say that Angola has decided to join the world in terms of the compliance issues to fight against corruption, to fight against money laundering, to fight against financing terrorism. Because of that, we believe that the rules and regulations to open a bank account or to maintain a bank account are similar to the rest of Africa or rest of the world. So Angola is busy progressing to that level of compliance, which is important. And perhaps some NGOs are not familiar with this big wave of change that the economy is facing. So, but I cannot comment on particular situation, but it should reflect Angola's desire to move into a more compliance banking system that brings system stability. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And hopefully that will address also indirectly a question that was also posed here in the chat room about most of the commercial lending being to the highly politically connected individuals and not necessarily, helping the economy in that regard. I'm not going to ask you to answer, Fausto. It's just a comment that someone made. But giving the floor to Alves da Rocha to comment on your earlier presentation about agriculture, I want also to add, Alves da Rocha, a question that came about the Chinese investments in agriculture in Angola that resulted in a wave of new privatizations of some of the different initiatives that were highly costly for the public revenue. So if you can also add a comment on that.
Ok, estou a ser ouvido?
Sim, sim.
Ok.
Am I being heard? Yes. 2 or 3 small comments in relation to agriculture, in also to answer by some of the people who posed some questions. Why is it that agriculture doesn't have the weight and the influence it should have in terms of improving the economy and also in terms of improving the production of the country? I worked for over 20 years in the development, in the planning ministry, and I remember a number of projects that were left because of external shocks. Agriculture has always been part of the plan of the government as an important sector. I shouldn't have to go back to just after the independence, when the agricultural sector was going to be organized through cooperation and cooperatives. So I don't have to go back that far to think about how important agriculture has been to the people who govern Angola. But things haven't worked despite these concerns and having been included in the public investment and budgets. There were projects, actions in agriculture. They didn't work somehow. And we can't also forget that the agricultural economy in Angola is basically a peasant type of agriculture. It's done by small farmers. It's subsistence family agriculture. And to provide loans or credit, it's difficult when we can't provide guarantees to the material guarantee to these banking institutions, because as I've already mentioned, there are a number of initiatives in terms of eliminating the problem with land property, because in the doing business sector of the World Bank, this is referred to as something that is very difficult for the business environment in Angola, the issue of property. In terms of infrastructure, we also have a lack of infrastructure, or the infrastructure there is around is not of quality. And infrastructure is necessary to link agriculture to the centers of the market. So this means that a lot of agricultural production goes bad because they haven't been able to be sent to the market. So we have the problem of loan, we have the problem of property, we have the problem of land production, we have the logistic problem of agriculture, and the fact that the idea of investigation. There is no, research. There is no agricultural research in Angola. In the colonial times, yes. But now we're wanting to go back to researching agriculture in a sustainable way, which allow us to improve the cultures, the crops that Angola produces, and diversify agriculture, introducing new crops. Those were the points I wanted to highlight. And in relation, specifically in terms of research, it's absolutely essential in agriculture, as with other areas of society and economy. Mr. Rocha, before going back to Fausto, I would like to ask you about something you mentioned in your introduction in relation to statistics, where you said in a very diplomatic way that the national accounts could have been affected by the skill. Yes, I have written about this before. I could comment on this. And I wrote this in the expansion seminar. In the last 22, 23 years, I worked in the planning ministry. I wasn't a minister, I was simply an advisor, but there was a number of situations in which the data that we produce They weren't published because of political convenience. And this is a certain worry I had in this, with regard to this incident with public accounts, because there are a number of newspapers that they said that they had access to a document in relation to public accounts, and that said that the rate of GDP growth in the second quarter had been less than minus 12.6%. And then there was this incident of the NEP director having to leave. There was a new administration, and the press said that he had left because he refused to publish the accounts, which he believed to be true, so as not to go against official positions in relation to what had happened in the second quarter of 2020, this year. So it's clear. So when we started to see the accounts being released in 2013, 14, or 15, I was one of the main people who praised the effort of the department, because the national accounts is the only way that we can interpret the economy. The balance of payments also allow us some idea, but it's important to see the national accounts. So therefore, I worry that we may be going back to the times in which, due to political convenience, we didn't get to know what was actually happening, the true information. Because it is good to know that if we cannot trust this information, we can have very high probabilities of reaching the wrong decisions or wrong, erroneous decisions, or to make decisions based on information that doesn't correspond to the truth. So this is what I said. And again, I will say again publicly that I'm a little bit in doubt. I used to believe in the data provided by the national accounts. And I have to say that when the last director was there, he collaborated in the national accounts, in the poverty rates for 2018-19. And we used to have a good relationship with the department in terms of establishing what the calculation would be. And I would like not to have to doubt the information. But unfortunately, this incident, which I don't believe was clarified, because the department in it has published this information saying that that was the right account, but not the one that some newspapers had said it was, where they said that the actual accounts showed the recession that was actually taking place. Because we need trust. We need to trust the policies of the government. People need to trust the messages that these policies are putting forward, that this is the model, these are the best policies, because without trust, we can't do anything. And all these incidents can undermine any incidents that may undermine this confidence, it's not good. Thank you very much. I thought that was very useful to your observation.
She was, until quite recently, the UK Prime Minister's trade envoy for Angola. And she has asked for the floor. So I would like the organizers to just unmute her so she can address the conference. Baroness, you have the floor. Baroness, can you unmute your mic, please? I think Anna, maybe Anna, you can help me. We are trying to give the floor to Baroness Northover, but I don't see what is going on. I think she has to unmute the mic. All right, while you try to sort it out, I wanted to ask Fauzi one more question. Fauzi, you mentioned the debt issue. In fact, Alves da Rocha also mentioned the debt issue. And everybody is following the news and concerned about the rise of the debt to GDP ratio in Angola. And we know that a big portion of that debt is to China. It's the first time that we have the real figures, published or announced by the government, around 20 billion. That's quite significant. So I wonder, from your vantage point as an observer in the banking sector, how do you see the development of these discussions? You alluded to the possibility that restructuring may be possible. So maybe you can just comment further on that, Fauzi.
Thank you very much, Carlos. With regards to debt restructuring negotiations with China, let me perhaps use this forum to say Standard Bank organized sideline meetings during the last IMF annual meetings, and we had two guests. One was governor of BNA, the other was an official from the IMF, and from the two participants, it was clear to us that we should expect an official communication before year end about what is the final position on that. But they were both very optimistic that a deal has been reached with China. So it's general sentiment that Angola was successful in obtaining a debt restructuring, which means that Angola will likely to continue to pay interest, but principal will be saved for a few years. But again, we do not have any official documentation on that. As the other market participants, we await confirmation. But when we read Minister of Finance statements where they are even making more dollars available to the market, it sounds that they are confident that the deal has been achieved as well. So we look forward to see final documentation official on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that clarification. I think we have attained the limit of the time that was allocated for us to cover the topic. I really want to congratulate warmly both Alves da Rocha and Fauzi Musa for excellent presentations, very informative. We really covered a lot of ground. I think we could not only dwell on the evolution of the Angolan economy over the last 2 decades, but also some of the causes of the current crisis, the measures that are in place, the limits of those measures, and how we are going to have to deal with the consequences of some of the policies being implemented, particularly in light of the recommendations of the IMF, how Angola can really embrace reform with all the difficulties and challenges that were already there, plus COVID heading to the blues. But we also end up with a bit of optimism on the opportunities, particularly on the agricultural sector, in terms of how Angola should diversify its economy and make sure that some of the changes that are going to be implemented through these reforms are going to respond to the real needs of jobs, the real needs of changing the social indicators that have been deteriorated quite significantly over the last few years. And we are all, going to have to deal with the social impact, but also the political impact, given the youth dimension of this debate, the fact that unemployment is pervasive mostly amongst young people. So with this, I really want to thank you both Alves da Rocha and Fauzi Musa, and hand over the floor to Alex for the next session.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and thank you to Faucio and Alves da Rocha. We're going to take a 10-minute break just to allow people to stretch, get a drink, and then we'll be back.
Obrigado, nós vamos agora parar pouquinho.
And then we will be having our second session of the afternoon, which is on opposition and civil society perspectives on economic inclusion. We'll be talking about agriculture, I'm sure we'll be talking about youth, we'll be talking about how a reform of the economy can take place. And we have 3 speakers for the next session. Andre Gaspar Mendes de Carvalho, who's the president of the opposition party CASA, otherwise also known as General Miao. Salsatina Kutaye, who's the acting director for the Angola of the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa. And finally, Rafael Masanga Savimbi Jr., who's the secretary for international relations of the opposition party UNITA. So no more from me now, and we'll be back at 10 minutes past the hour. So in 10 minutes, we'll be back. Thank you very much. It's Alex Vines here, and I'm Director of the Africa Program at Chatham House. And I'm delighted to be chairing this second session, which is looking at opposition and civil society perspectives on economic inclusion. We have three speakers for this second session. First of all, we'll have Andre Gaspar Mendes de Carvalho. As I already mentioned to you, he is president of CASA, the opposition party. I met Andre Gaspar Mendes de Carvalho many years ago when he was the defense attaché of Angola in the Republic for the Republic of Zimbabwe and also for Mozambique. He's also been director of international relations of the Ministry of the National Defense of National Defense of Angola, and has also had a number of other roles, including as head of the political directorate of the Angolan Navy and head of the political directorate of the Ministry of Interior of the Republic of Angola. I'm very grateful that he can find time to join us today. So with more ado, I will introduce him first to you, offer him the platform to speak, and then we will go to the next speaker. So welcome to Chatham House, Andre Gaspar Mendes de Carvalho, over to you.
Meu caro diretor, Alex Vines, é prazer voltar a revê-lo depois de muitos anos. Eu agradeço o convite.
Dear Director Alex Vines, it's a pleasure to see you again after so many years.
Neste fórum.
It's a pleasure to take part in this forum. And I have to say that I deeply enjoyed the first part, the first session, in which I had the privilege to hear the considerations of Alves da Rocha and Faucio. I wasn't acquainted with the Mozambican representative who offered a depth of knowledge in his presentation. So again, I'm pleased to take part in this forum, and I am at your avail. Please tell me when can I use my 10 minutes to start my considerations, please. Please go ahead. Well, the theme involved the perspective of opposition and civil society on economic inclusion. In fact, it is in the financial sector that we identify the most patent facts of exclusion in the Angolan economy, having ripples in a number of other sectors, in the political life, in the economy, and in the social realm in the country. Well, bear in mind that the state is the most important economic agent in Angola, based on its presence, the strategic areas of oil and gas, diamonds, and among other ores, of energy, of essential services, water, public transportation, be them via airways, railways, and highways, and also the banking system that make of the states the most important and solid link in the economy, be it for the good and for the bad. The fact is that everything needs to go through the state. Entrepreneurs are only successful when in partnership with the state. And usually this is the executive power that the government, with not a lot of exemption and lacking ethics, one is able to have access to land, loans, construction sites, usually without public tenders or with fixed tenders, all of which looking for one's own interests and social strata belonging to those parts. of their inner circles. So corruption is a mandate to be combated, especially those who have embezzled from the wealth of the country, and these should be forbidden to take part in the government, and also those who have been benefited by nepotism. We shouldn't take any stand as to whether there should be more or less state. The fact is that the state should take part of the economy in full dependence on the development of society as a whole. There's a need for more presence of the state, the less developed society is, and there will be a smaller need of state whenever there is more development of society as a whole. Now, what are the most important social strata that have been struck by discrimination? I'd say those who are handicapped, youth coming from the lower echelons of the population, both from urban centers and the countryside, women from the outskirts of urban centers, and also, indistinctly, citizens who are not affiliated with any political party in the government. And also, most of the population who today live in unemployment, in misery, and lacking any hope for a better future. On the other hand, it's important to understand the geographic relief of the country, those areas who do not receive the minimum resources to meet their primary needs. And with that, we state that this is a fact that calls for a better national integration. There are lands dubbed as being the end of the world lands. This has been a moniker used since the colonial areas, and they continue to be dubbed as so because they lack resources, infrastructures, and they are at their own as to its resolution. Economic inclusion is more feasible when there's a healthy economy, but more difficult when there is a crisis. There is a greater contention for resources, and crises presents an opportunity for greater inclusion. Therefore, it's important to understand what is the strategy for recovery and the reform of the economy. With the opposition and its prowess, and it's important to understand their perspective on social inclusion, economic inclusion. In the short term, we see such inclusion with a certain level of skepticism. There would be a need for a better development or a better performance of the economy in order to allow for greater inclusion. Inclusion and the reform of the education system would better qualify those sectors which are more frail. These are issues that need to be better analyzed. However, inclusion doesn't depend only on objective factors. There should be political will to make it happen, but one cannot deny that a decisive step towards the strengthening of institutions is of dire need. We claim that those intended developments in the economy and in the social realms depend on political prowess in the parliament, the local elections that would lead to the decentralizing of the power and a better distribution of wealth with greater inclusion. A review and revision of the Constitution, a revision on the side of the president as to how he or she is being elected, the process of election counting, all of this is of greatest urgency in order to allow for greater inclusion. There are a number of other aspects that I would like to make reference to. Inclusion encompasses the understanding of those who have embezzled the country of its resources and their own benefit are part of the problem, and they should be part of the solution, not only in regards to the bringing back of such resources to the nation, and they should be part of the economy reform. In the case of Angola, COVID-19 should not be a continuous handicap in the economy. Angola might be able to find other venues and pathways in order to conjugate economic development with the direct effects of pandemic in the country. We understand that it will only be sustainability if there is an interest to not leave anyone behind. And the recovery and economic diversification can be made possible based on a minimal degree of education, a minimum degree of experience and qualification, with that magnifying all those areas that already work well in various sectors such as agriculture, cattle herding, artisanship, manufacturing, agriculturally based industry, all of this as a starting point from which all of those who are qualified by universities, colleges, who will now be entering in the market in the midterm with a certain degree of technological and scientific qualification, something that still is yet to come to pass. It does not exist. Now, foreign investment should offer material and technological means, mostly to the oil sector, diamond exploration, and other ores that will support economy development in order to have the nation walk with its own strength. Inclusion and the lack of it makes direct reference to the health standards of the economy. If the economy is in a downturn, it will be harder, but that sometimes can pose some opportunities. And to conclude, I'd like to say that inclusion is the outcome of an attainment. And Bela will, in fact, win the elections at any cost or make the economy development something that is of utmost importance. So with this, I conclude. This has been a theme that has been posed to me, perspectives of social society and economy inclusion. Thank you so much.
André Gaspar Mendes de Carvalho, thank you very much for your presentation, talking about the importance of leveling up the country, making sure that there's less inequality, recognizing the difficulties that Angola is facing in a situation where the economy is so challenged by COVID-19 and the depression of commodity prices. We will come back to questions and answers. So please, if you've got questions for André Gaspar Mendes de Carvalho, put them into the Q&A box or put your hand up and we will come to question time shortly. My next guest is Sizaltina Kutaya. She currently serves as the acting director at the Open Society Initiative for Southern Africa, OSISA, based in Talatona in Luanda. She is a feminist and human rights activist with years of experience in project management, She trained in the business management and law at the Catholic University of Angola. Cisaltina, I know this is the first time that you've been involved with Chatham House, so welcome. And I look very much forward to hearing your presentation. Please, Cisaltina, unmute yourself, turn your video on, and let's hear you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alex, and thank you to the Chatham House for the invitation. I would like also to join my voice to Almirante to thank the first presenters for this event. I think this has been a quite interesting discussion. When I think about the perspectives of civil society with regards to economic inclusion, I have to be appreciative of the fact that for a long period of time, Angola civil society organizations have mostly concentrated on fighting for civic and political rights, fighting for the rights to freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and the economic and social and economic rights have not been, in many cases, the priority of civil society organizations. So at this point where civic and political rights have improved quite a degree, the challenge for civil society organizations is to begin to participate in the conversation on the economic reform, economic inclusion, and also economic justice in the country. So, but I think it's important when we talk about economic inclusion to consider the people that we are talking about, the people that need to be included in that in the economy of the country. And in the case of Angola, I think these people are particularly young people and women who have been subject to economic disempowerment. Women constitute the majority of people in the informal sector. There are also other cultural and traditional instances and factors that prevent women from accessing economic freedom and prosperity, and also the young people, which also make up the majority of the population. And when we look at the statistics of unemployment, it's the people between the ages of 18 and 25 that are mostly unemployed in the country. So, so considering the people that we are talking about when we talk about economic inclusion is fundamental for the conversation. I think that I want to make looking into the perspective of entrepreneurship, which is a central pillar of the government policies for economic inclusion. I think it's very problematic in the context of Angola, and because it sells an idea of self-employment, which becomes very problematic in the context of inequality, high levels of inequality in the country. And also, it's difficult to realize in an economy which fails to provide basic minimums, an economy which is sustained in inequality, and particularly in the context of the pandemic, because I think that self-employment, it's very problematic in a country where the infrastructure is not there for people to really succeed. And this has been, entrepreneurship has been one of the biggest pillars of government policy for economic empowerment. And I think it's important as civil society for us to have a critical look into this policy. I also think that it's difficult for us to talk about economic inclusion without considering the idea of redistribution, and economic justice in a country in which, again, the basic minimums are not there. And while the government is putting forward some programs for money schemes for poor people, still, I think it's impossible for us to achieve economic inclusion without really looking into the redistribution of wealth and also redistribution of privilege and access. And when we talk about that, we also look into access to education, which with the policies that have been adopted through the macro structural plans that have been put into place. Education, access to education is becoming a commodity of those who have money, because we've just changed our Education Act, in which people are having to pay, particularly for secondary school students. So in a context like this, it really becomes complicated, and it becomes difficult to talk about the inclusion of these marginalized people economically. I think those are my remarks relating to the issue, and I'm open to further comments and questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cisaltina, talking about the importance of civil and political rights, and also recognizing where there have been improvements, but how economic reform and economic justice in particular has plenty of room for improvement. You highlight the importance particularly of the majority youth and women, and the need to integrate those into a better developmental vision for the Angolan state, and that this is a multi-layered long-term project, from what I hear from what you're saying, including looking at how to increase economic inclusion, meaning in terms of wealth, but also access to education. So this is not just about wealth, but it sounds to me also that you're suggesting this is about class. Anyway, we will come back to all of these issues, but we have a final speaker before the Q&A. So please, if you have any questions to Almirante Miao or to Cisaltina or to our final speaker that you're going to hear now, please put them through the Q&A and we'll get to them. The final speaker is Rafael Masanga Savimbi Jr., and he's the Secretary for International Relations of the União Nacional para a Independencia Total de Angola, UNITA, as is more widely known. Rafael, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, or early this evening for some of us. This is, I know, your first time speaking at Chatham House, so you're particularly welcome. Rafael, over to you. Please unmute yourself, turn your video on, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Alex.
Faz favor.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Of course, this is my first time of being part of this. And let me say that I'm going to do my presentation in Portuguese. But if need be, we also try to put some things in English. Muito obrigado pela oportunidade.
Thank you very much for your opportunity.
Felicitar os meus colegas de painel.
I would like to congratulate my panel members.
E dizer que
and to say
Angola
that
de 1975
Angola, since 1975,
período longo
lived a very long period
que facilitou a explosão política
that made it possible for the political exclusion
com consequências graves no plano econômico.
with huge consequences in the economic sector.
Na nossa maneira de ver,
From our point of view,
nós UNITA,
us from UNITA,
há uma forte ligação entre
we can see a strong link between
a exclusão política
the political exclusion
e a exclusão econômica.
and economic exclusion.
Ou então, há uma ligação entre
In other words, there's a link
e a inclusão econômica.
between politics and economic inclusion.
De 2002
From
para cá,
2002 onwards,
pois embora a situação seja diferente,
and although we have been going through a very different situation,
já não há conflito,
there are no longer any conflicts,
continuamos a assistir
we continue to see
ambiente econômico difícil
a difficult economic environment
para os cidadãos,
for our population,
porque prevalece a cultura
because we still have a culture
político-partidária na sociedade,
of party politics in society,
em que o acesso às oportunidades
where access to opportunities
é vetado
is prohibited
aos muitos que ou não são do partido da situação,
those which are not members of the incumbent party,
ou então não alinham com
or are
algumas...
not aligned with that party's view.
E vindo até aqui,
Having
também
said all this,
é sabermos
we
que,
know
de um lado, a população angolana cresce ano após ano.
and we know that the Angolan population grows year after year,
E a maioria desta população
and
muito
jovem.
jovem.
Most of this population is very young.
E do outro lado,
And on the other hand,
vemos alguns indicadores macroeconômicos
we have some macroeconomic indicators
a decrescerem assustadoramente.
that are falling in a drastic way.
Dou alguns exemplos.
I'll give some examples.
O PIB nominal em dólares
The nominal GDP in dollars
de 2009
from 2009
foi estimada em cerca de 89 mil milhões.
was estimated to be 89 billion.
E o PIB
Million, sorry, billion.
De 2020, ou da fase inicial deste ano de 2020,
And in 2020, at the beginning of this year, the GDP was
que já é de cerca de 67 mil milhões.
67 billion.
E quando vamos indexar a isso a população,
And then when we bring this to the population,
vemos que ela está a crescer. De 2019, éramos cerca de 30 milhões de habitantes.
we can see the growth in the population from 2019, it was 30 million.
E no princípio, ou na fase inicial de 2020, de 31 milhões já.
And we've already reached 31 million at the beginning of 2020.
Então, é ver que
So you can see
o PIB vai baixando, a população vai subindo.
We can see that the GDP is going down and the population is going up.
E então ali podemos também pegar num terceiro fator,
So we can look at the third factor,
o PIB per capita, e vemos
which
é
is
como é que os cidadãos angolanos estão ou vão perdendo o seu poder de compra.
we can see that from the GDP per capita that the Angolan population is losing their purchasing power.
O que significa que a pobreza em Angola está a aumentar.
This means that the poverty in Angola is increasing.
Então, como falar de inclusão econômica
So how can we talk about economic inclusion
numa situação destas?
in a situation like this?
Mas como não queremos só trazer ou críticas ou más notícias,
As we don't want to bring only bad news,
no quadro das perspectivas, nós temos uma ideia.
we have an idea for the future.
O que eu estou a chamar de fatores que podem propiciar a inclusão econômica em Angola.
I'm talking about factors that may lead to economic inclusion in Angola.
Falo da necessidade de termos reformas políticas e econômicas.
I'm talking about the need for economic and reforms.
Vou citar algumas.
I'm going to mention some.
A primeira é a definição de uma agenda de futuro para o país.
The first is the establishment of an agenda for the future of the country.
Do nosso ponto de vista, o país está a ser gerido casuisticamente.
From our point of view, the country is being managed ad hoc.
Há necessidade de todos os intervenientes,
We have a need for everyone,
partidos políticos, sociedade civil, igrejas, mas toda a gente,
political parties, civil society, the church, everyone,
sentar, fazermos uma avaliação do passado, do nosso passado comum, como país.
We need to sit down together and do a big assessment of our common past in the country.
E, consequentemente, projetarmos o futuro.
And consequently, start to think and plan for the future.
E ali falaremos do futuro de todos os angolanos.
And then we have to be talking about the future of every Angolan person.
Eu acho que este elemento é fundamental.
This is absolutely essential.
Não temos plano de futuro para dentro de 30, 40, 50 anos.
We don't have a plan for the future, for a long future, such as 40, 50 years.
Dou exemplo prático sobre esta situação. É, por exemplo, a questão dos planos diretores das cidades, nas províncias.
For example, I could give you an example of the city master plans in the provinces, for example.
Qual é o plano diretor, por exemplo, da província de Luanda?
What is the master plan for the city of Luanda, for the province of Luanda?
Existe, não é partilhado.
If it exists, it's not shared.
É por isso que, para o nosso caso aqui na capital, vamos vendo, por exemplo, que as construções são feitas muitas das vezes de forma anárquica.
That's why here in the capital we can see the building takes place in a very anarchic way.
E depois de um ano ou dois, estão a demolir as casas dos cidadãos porque aí vai passar uma estrada.
And 2 or 3 years later, we can see houses, people's houses being demolished because they're going to put a road through there.
Outro fator que nós consideramos importante é a revisão da Constituição.
Another important factor is the revision of our constitution.
O presidente da República de Angola não é eleito de forma direta. Eu acho que foi uma grande regressão.
Yeah, the president of Angola is not elected directly, and I think this is a great setback.
Porque, ao menos, quando houve a revisão em 1991 da Constituição foi pontual, mas ao menos introduziu-se a eleição direta do Presidente da República.
In 1991, we had some revision of the constitution. It was specific to certain points, but at least we had the direct election of the president.
Outro fator é a revisão pontual da lei eleitoral e da lei da Comissão Nacional Eleitoral.
Another point is the revision of the electoral law and the electoral commission law.
Porque na situação atual da Angola,
in the current situation,
a natureza, a composição e o funcionamento da Comissão Nacional Eleitoral, a partir dão vantagem competitiva ao partido da situação.
The way that the National Electoral Commission is at the moment, its composition and nature gives benefits, advantages to the party in power at the moment.
Vamos para uma competição eleitoral onde a partida sabe-se que ganhar é difícil.
We go into elections knowing that it will be difficult to win.
Então, neste caso, as eleições não podem ser consideradas livres e justas, porque alguém parte com uma certa vantagem.
So in this case, we can't think of elections as being fair and free because there are some parties got more advantage than others.
Outro fator é a despartidarização da administração pública.
Another factor is the departidarization of the public administration.
O que acontece em Angola é que as oportunidades, como já disse lá acima, mesmo a nível do acesso ao aparelho do Estado.
What happens in Angola is, as we said, even in terms of access to the government,
também faz-se com base na pertença ao partido político.
Happens based on somebody's political membership.
O que às vezes faz com que melhores quadros de Angola não tenham acesso e então não tenham capacidade de prestarem os seus serviços à nação.
This means that perhaps sometimes the best people in Angola don't have access and they're not able to provide services, the best services that the country could have.
Outro fator importante.
Another important factor.
Pelo meu colega do painel, o presidente Miao.
Already mentioned by Miao.
É a descentralização.
Is decentralization.
É implementarmos e termos eleições autárquicas.
We need to have independent elections.
Termos eleições autárquicas em todos os municípios.
In every municipality.
Porque as autarquias têm a vantagem de resolverem os problemas do dia a dia da comunidade a nível local.
Because local government have the right, they have the ability to address the problems that they're dealing with themselves.
Tudo começa pela vizinhança.
Everything happens and starts with the neighborhood.
Independentemente de pertencer à UNITA, ao MPLA, à Casa CE, à FNLA, são vizinhos, vivem na mesma comunidade e são os mais capazes em resolver os problemas da área que devem passar em frente.
Independently of, regardless of what party they belong, they're all neighbors and they understand the areas and they should be able to be involved on how things are done.
E também dizer
and also to say
os não partidários têm de estar também na consideração dos partidários.
And those who are not members of any political parties must also be taken into account.
Porque muitas das vezes é de lá onde virá a solução.
Because often that's where solutions will be coming from.
Este elemento, este fator,
this factor,
bastante para a inclusão, digamos, política, mas também econômica.
This factor is very important and contributes not only for political inclusion, but also to economic improvement.
outro fator importante, são vários. Vou citar
There are many important factors. I'm going to mention some of them.
Rafael, faz favor, só temos 4 minutos mais.
Ok, muito obrigado.
Obrigado.
Minutes.
E então eu dizia
So as I was saying,
que é preciso que a economia, e eu sou defensor desta escola,
I believe that
deve ser mesmo de mercado,
we should have a market economy. I believe in this,
na livre iniciativa.
based on free initiative.
Haver menos Estado na economia.
We should have less state in our economy.
O Estado deve ser o regulador,
The state must be the regulator.
deve organizar as bases,
It must organize the grassroots and the basis,
deixar os indivíduos na sua iniciativa realizarem a economia.
but should let individuals to organize the economy through their own initiative.
Os angolanos devem ser olhados como cidadãos e não como membros de um partido político.
Angolan people need to be looked as citizens and not as members of political parties.
Ainda hoje, a
Today,
maioria dos empresários angolanos
most businessmen
têm uma ligação ou um afeto, ou até mesmo são, na sua maioria, militantes do partido que governa hoje.
they have a link or some sort of affiliation to a political party.
O que exclui angolanos que pensam diferentemente
This excludes Angolans who think differently
em terem acesso às oportunidades e realizar negócio.
in their opportunities to do business.
Vou mesmo terminar.
Rafael, faz o ponto final. Faltamos tempo agora.
Eu concluo dizendo que a
I will
UNITA
conclude.
está disponível para, em conjunto com os demais parceiros,
I conclude by saying that UNITA, together with its partners
e com a sociedade,
and with society,
criar as condições
will create the conditions
para reforçarmos
to improve
ou para aplicarmos as reformas que se imponham,
or to apply the necessary reforms
para podermos assentar os alicerces firmes e seguros
so that we can build the foundations, the strong foundations
para a construção de uma Angola
For the-
desenvolvida e inclusiva.
for the building of a developed and inclusive Angola.
Muito obrigado. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
Rafael, thank you very much for talking about UNITA's vision for Angola, talking about how there needed to be an end of neo-patrimonialism in Angola, how for you, you had a vision of the need for constitutional and electoral reform, the depoliticization of public administration, and understood the really massive challenge of youth unemployment, particularly with a GDP that is declining. And so therefore there needs to be economic reform. We now have time for a question and answer session with all three speakers. Please continue to send your questions in. I have a few already. The first question that came in was to Almirante Miao. Admiral, please, the next general elections are in 2 years' time. If you were to gain power, if CASA got a majority, would you carry on with the anti-corruption policies that the MPLA is pursuing? And what would be your approach to the IMF? How would you engage with the FME, the IMF? Almirante, please unmute yourself, turn your video on, and we look forward to your answer. Have we lost you?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you. Please.
Okay. The first question, I will respond in Portuguese.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Portanto, Eu devo dizer,
I'd like to say,
devo esclarecer
I'd like to clarify
que esta questão do combate à corrupção
that this issue in relation to combating corruption it's a banner of the whole of the Angolan society. It's not MPLA that started to fight the fight against corruption, but the opposition and civil society. President João Lourenço decided to implement this policy, but this was something already demanded by society for a long time. To say that there was bad administration, that the state's resources were being dilapidated, and that if we win the elections, we're going to continue with this policy, because we don't see this as a policy that belongs to the MPLA. I should also say that implementing this fight against corruption, we also have our own way of addressing it. We believe that we should always bring together coercive factors with persuasive factors. There's a big difference here. In the policies used by João Lourenço, he has for 6 months persuasive policies, and then he believes that the problem should be addressed through coercive measures. But I think they have to be used at the same time, measures which are coercive together with persuasive measures, because it's also important to recover the money that is abroad, and this is only possible, and these resources are necessary for our economy, if we have the collaboration of the people who have money abroad. Otherwise, we're just going to have the crumbs, and we're going to lose what's most essential, which are the benefits that this money could bring to us. In relation to the IMF, we have to carry on with international organizations, but we have to ensure that we have to work for the best interests of Angola. Not everything that comes from the FME is right. Not everything that comes from them is wrong as well. So we need to have this dynamics to be able to use what is positive and also leave aside those things which are not recommended for our reality. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can hear you very clearly. Thank you, Admiral.
See? Yes, we can hear you. So this is the question, is what I have to give. No, I don't know if there are any other questions.
We're fine for the moment. I have another question, but it is to all the panelists. So the question is about the following. It's the questioner asked from the previous session, it is clear that there won't be much economic prosperity to be shared in the next few years. And we can remember the slides that Faucio Musa showed, for example. Can political inclusion unlock the economic constraints? So the question really is, what comes first? Economic or political inclusion? Salsatina, what would be your priority? Focusing on economic or political inclusion?
Thank you, Alex. I think that's a tough question, but I believe there is a really strong connection between the two. And I think that political inclusion can unlock economic inclusion. And I say this because I think in times, because I think political inclusion, political participation will imply commitment from government and also from the people, which then creates sustainable environment for economic inclusion. And I think that in our countries, and in Angola particularly, it's always the political state, the political situation, which then aggravates economic stability. And I think that in times of crisis, in times of difficulties, there is need to reaffirm principles. And when I talk, when I say principles, I think I'm talking about rule of law, justice, and so on, to deal with the crisis. And I think a lot of times government misses the sight of it, and it can complicate things. And one example is, in a time when we are trying to attract foreign direct investment, and people are being beaten up in the street because they are trying to protest, because they are trying to exercise their basic rights, I'm not sure what kind of message that sends out to somebody who wants to come to Angola and invest in Angola when they can just lose a whole day of businesses because it's impossible to exercise basic civic and political rights. Another example can be when we manipulate statistics, for instance, for political purposes. How can we properly plan? How can we properly put adequate public policies which can respond to the absolute needs in the field if we don't have real and credible statistics? So I think that economic inclusion can be a consequence of a true political inclusion in a situation like Angola.
Thank you very much, Cisaltina. I have a question that I'm going to ask Rafael Savimbi Jr., which is that one of the questioners says, regarding reform of institutions, for example, you need political will, but that entirely relies on the citoyen. Regarding the agenda for the future, how are the opposition political parties in dialogue with civil society structures, such as the ONGs, the neighborhood associations, and so on, to jointly build an agenda? And what windows of opportunity exist for more active participation of opposition and civil society in decision-making processes? So this is a question fundamentally about coalition building. And I wonder if you'd like to answer that question. Thank you very much. That's to Rafael Savimbi Jr.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Thank you very much. And I'm going to try to answer it in English. Let me say that, yes, one of the main policies of this year, and definitively of the forthcoming 3 years of our leadership, is to prioritize the cooperation between political parties, our political party in this case, with civil society. It is our belief that yes, the political parties are very important to fight and get power to rule, but civil society is a strategic partnership because they are there not only to push, but they do express the real will of the entire population. When we talk about the necessity of being in partnership with the civil society, we do mean that yes, we can exist as political party, but it is crucial for UNITA to make sure that we work and we work hands in hands to ensure that democracy is a reality in our country, but also to ensure that the participation in the public life of our country must not only depend on the political affiliation of somebody. This is our point of view.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're beginning to run out of time, but there are some raised hands, I think. So Nuduya Junior, if you want to ask your question, we will allow you to be unmuted and to ask it. So just hang on, wait one moment, and hopefully we can unmute you and you can ask your question. Is it going to work? Yes, you're unmuted, Nduya Junior. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you. I'm Mr. Ndoya Junior from DRC. I'm so delighted to be here with you, talking about economic and policy about development in Africa. I think Africa needs youth commitment. I want you to tell me about youth commitment in public and political life in Angola. How do they act about this matter?
Thank you very much. So I'll add to that, particularly to all three speakers, in that there have been demonstrations by youth. And so how do you see those? Are you concerned? What do you think they're going to, what are they as statements? And to Almirante Miao, but also to Rafael Savimbi Jr., there was a question that as parliamentarians, you enjoy a certain amount of privilege. You have benefits and allowances. How does that sit with the demonstrations of youth? So if all three speakers, so I'll turn to Almirante Miao first, if you'd like to respond to that particular set of questions.
Não sei se posso começar.
If I may.
Yeah, please.
Alex, is that okay? Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we understand that the representatives, those representing the parliament, have the full measure of condition to undertake their duties. We understand that the seminal importance here is to have them fulfill their attributions with the intent to allow for the youth, and not only for the youth, but all the society, all that is due unto them, that they are rightfully have access to. So this is the answer we have to give you. The very hard means we have, of course, there are some exaggerations, but we have the means to undertake our duties. But we do have the means given to us, and with that we use these means to undertake our duties with quality in order to bring to society those so needed transformations to bring about the well-being to the population. This is exactly what we do. This is the answer to the question.
Thank you very much. Cisaltina, do you have anything? Cisaltina, if you'd like to respond to the role of youth and how you see youth in this conversation.
I think for the time being, we are seeing a different form of civic engagement in Angola, where we are transitioning from traditional NGOs and associations to social movements, which are majority made up of young people. While these groups and gatherings are also still learning on how, I think there is also a growing conscience that is emerging in the country, which relates to rights, which relates to the specificities of their demands. For instance, when they are fighting this recent protests and demonstrations, they very specifically speaking about a commitment, a clear political commitment from the government for local elections. And I think this is an interesting and exciting thing to see, because for the longest time, participation has always been a privilege of a specific set of gathering, which took the form of NGOs and associations. So I think there is plenty of opportunity to still grow, because these young people also need to. There is an investment in political and economic and rights literacy for these groups. But I think this new formulation of civil society engagement into political and economic processes is very exciting. I wanted to say something about a comment that I saw in the Q&A section, which speaks, it's a question about entrepreneurship, and if not entrepreneurship and self-employment, what is the alternative? I think it's very important to distinguish between self-employment, entrepreneurship, and surviving. Because when we look at the programs for, it's called Program for Advancement of Employment, something like that, PAPE. When we look at that, that's not a program that seeks to promote or strengthen entrepreneurship or self-employment. That is a program which replicates what we currently have, which is people trying to survive in the informal sector. When they are met with violence for police, when they are met with a lot of hardships, which make it difficult for people to make ends meet. And I think I think what needs to improve is that because the difference between just trying to survive and self-employment has a lot to do with the conditions under which one exercises the work. And I think this is an important conversation that needs to take place in the country. And I'll shut down for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cesaltina, and thank you also for answering that particular question. We're beginning to run out of time, so I'm going to ask each panelist one question each, and then we'll finish. And it's the following. So this is a question to Almirante Miao, to Cesaltina, and to Rafael Savimbi Jr. The question is the following. Over the last few years, what, in your opinion, is the most successful thing that the João Lourenço administration has achieved? So what's the best thing, the most successful new action that the government of Angola has achieved? And what would you like to see the government achieve? So what has it failed on, but you would like to see improvement? So first of all, Almirante Miao, over to you.
Muito obrigado. Uma pergunta interessante.
Thank you. Very interesting question. As we analyze the overview on the political, social, economic situation in Angola, the great turnaround, amongst all of these, one thing that is highlighted, that throughout a long period, the opposition and civil society have been attempting to convince not only the Angolan society, but also the international society that there was malfeasance, embezzlement, and the struggle was just restricted to convincing. There was embezzlement, there was malfeasance, and a lot of denial. That's not true, and so on. So the greatest transformation was with João Lourenço publicly acknowledging that there was, yes, malfeasance. There were groups of corrupts, that they could be there, even taking part of his party. That was a change of perspective, because from then on we will not squander time that trying to prove that there is lack or proper governing, but in fact go straight to the target, which is getting us rid of malfeasance and lack of proper management. So this is the most striking perspective that I have seen in João Lourenço's term. Thank you.
Cesaltina, what is the most impressive thing you've seen from the Lourenço administration, and what would it be that you'd like to see? So what would you like to see the government do if it was listening to you today?
I think I would concur with Almirante with regards to a stronger tone on the speech on the narrative around the fight against corruption. I think there's been quite some work done in that regard. But I also think that one of the things that need to happen in the country, I think it's the decentralization, the process of decentralization. I think it's crucial for unlocking a lot of the challenges and problems that we face, particularly at local level. I don't think it's possible to develop a country with such a centralized structure. I don't think because that centralized structure also takes away the opportunity of people's participation. And I don't think that you can have development when everything in a country depends on one man, no matter, regardless of how good and well-intentioned that man might be. So I think that if I was the president, my priority would have been to invest in the decentralization process and call for local elections as soon as possible, because that's really important for if we want to change anything in the country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cisaltina. Indeed, we were all thinking that there might be decentralization or limited decentralization elections in 2021, but recently I'm not very sure whether that's going to be the case. So the final person to speak is Rafael Masanga Savimbi Jr. So Rafael, what is it that surprised you, that made you happy about the Lorenzo administration? What do you think they did well? And what would you like them to do better?
Well, thank you. I'm going to answer this question in Portuguese.
Please.
Dizer que o que é que João Lourenço já fez?
What has João Lourenço done?
Do meu ponto de vista,
in my opinion,
João Lourenço deu bom ponto de saída.
Has started with a good first step against corruption.
Mas primeiro tem de dar mais passos.
There is yet more to be done in that regard.
É preciso redefinir o
But
conceito.
it's very important to redefine the concept of corruption.
Dou exemplo prático.
Let me give you an example.
Como é que estamos hoje nas administrações
públicas? Current state of public management.
Senão, então, há também a
Is
pequena corrupção.
there corruption?
Não são
Major
só
or minor?
os grandes processos, na verdade, com os grandes nomes.
Of course, there are the major names there.
Definir o conceito de corrupção, mesmo quando
first, we need to touch on the semantics of corruption.
Quer fazer necessidade menor ou maior,
well,
mas não
we should
tem
define that in minor or smaller or bigger cities.
WC, como se diz. E tem de parar num sítio, por exemplo, numa empresa, e ele vai dar 100 kwanzas, 0,1 tal dólares a guarda para ele.
Let's say that a company will pass on, give a kickback to an officer, a law enforcement officer, in order to safeguard security. That's also corruption.
Não seja problema do MPLA. Não, é problema
we don't think this is a problem of the MPLA. This is a problem that is systemic. We have interest to resolve corruption in all and different expressions we can find them. So, I would love to see some things happen.
Já disse a Cisaltina,
Cisaltina has already mentioned it would be important to have elections next year, decentralized, and have elections in all different cities in respect to the principle of equality stated in our charter.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado a todos. Particular thanks to Almirante Miao, Cisaltina, and you, Rafael Masanga Savimbi, for joining us this afternoon for this session talking about inclusion and the views of civil society and opposition. I do hope that you will join us tomorrow for the day 2 of Angola Forum 2020 from 14 hours London time, 15 hours Luanda time. We have a session on green growth and building back better in Angola. As some of you might remember, Angola showed leadership in the Paris climate negotiations. And it is something that if the Angolan economy is to be redesigned, which it, from our earlier session today, we heard about the declining importance of fossil fuels, then this green growth is absolutely essential for the future of Angola and its prosperity. So we have 3 speakers tomorrow, Giza Gaspar Martins, Vladimir Russo, and Alan Kane. And I will be handing over to Natalie Rusman, the incoming director for Namibia and Angola of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, to chair that meeting. She is based in Berlin currently, hasn't yet moved to Southern Africa. So thank you, everybody. Obrigado a todos, and keep safe and keep well. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Boa tarde, abraço, Rafael, Cisaltina.
Good afternoon. All the best, Rafael, Cisaltina, and Alex. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.